welcome everyone who's joined us today. Do introduce yourself in the chat, where you're from. We'll be starting in just a minute. Well, thank you to everyone in joining us today. My name is Nick Buxton. I work at the Transnational Institute and head up the Futures Labs, and we're really delighted to have you with us today for this third webinar in our series on China and the world. And today we'll be looking at China's political system. Do introduce yourself in the chat. For today's session, we're going to be moderated by Shan. Sandy is an organizer with Justice is Global. It's a US-based grassroots movement fighting for structural changes in the global economy. And she's been organizing with grassroots movements in the Pan-Asian diaspora since 2019. And we're really delighted that she's leading and going to be moderating this session with 4 great speakers. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for tuning in to the third webinar in this series on China and the world. The series is hosted by Transnational Institute, excuse me, co-sponsored by gongchao.org, Made in China Journal, Laosan, Critical China Scholars, and the Asia-Europe People's Forum. So the focus of our today's session is China's political system. I'm sure a lot of you in the audience can relate to me the fact that when dealing with a society such as China that's not yet completely open, you know, as observers, we sometimes have to make assumptions or resort to speculation. And I guess because of this, we also have a wide range of opinions and disagreements when it comes to China's political system. Questions like, you know, who really has power in China, right? Is it all in Xi Jinping's hands? And in addition to the Chinese Communist Party, are there other political actors and interests that affect the governance of China and its development trajectory? And what does it look like for everyday people in mainland China to interact with political system? And how does that differ in regions like Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong? Of course, we can't answer all these questions within the 2-hour time frame, but I hope that we can use this panel discussion as a primer and an introduction to China's political system that's oftentimes opaque, but not devoid of complexities and contradictions. So to begin to see that China's political system is not monolithic or rigid, and to resist equating China with its government or to the CCP is very important. In my work, I actually encounter lots of narratives perpetuated by right-wing figures and even by the foreign policy establishment that cast China as this monolithic and unitarian actor, which effectively reduces people in China as well as people in the Chinese diaspora to a homogenous collective assimilated into the Chinese government. And this kind of narrative not only fuels anti-China, anti-Chinese hysteria, but it also flattens the diversity of identity, opinions, and experiences of many individuals in China who display extraordinary bravery and resilience in the face of government crackdown, surveillance, and repression. So today we have a panel of brilliant scholars, activists, and organizers to share with us their insights and their take on China's political system. So very quickly, allow me to introduce them. So we have here Rebecca Karl, professor of history at New York University and author of China's Revolutions in the Modern World, a brief interpretive history. And we also have Darren Byler, assistant professor of international studies at Simon Fraser University and author of Terror, Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession, and Masculinity in a Chinese City. And we also have Yanyan Chan, postdoc fellow at Yale Law School and columnist at SupChina. And finally, we have Loong Yu, a longtime labor activist and author of Hong Kong in Revolt. So what's going to happen today in our panel is that panelists have prepared a brief presentation relating to their areas of interest and a couple of short video clips to add texture and interactivity to their presentations. And after the presentations, we will have 30 minutes in the end for members of the audience to ask questions or share their perspectives. Just a very quick note to the audience, you can post your questions at any time through the Zoom Q&A function. You can access the Q&A box by clicking on the Q&A tab on the control panel, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also encourage members in the audience to leave comments, suggestions in the chat, but please be respectful of each other's experiences and perspectives. And if you would like to live tweet this event, please use the TNI social media hashtag, hashtag TNI webinars. So before we start the formal presentation, can I ask each panelist to describe very briefly, how do you relate or how have you related to China's political system? Let's start with Yangyang.
Hi, thank you so much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be part of this panel. And so I was born and raised in China, and I came to the US in 2009 for graduate school and have stayed and worked since. And so I think my first experience with the Chinese political system is probably that shaped my experience in China. But I think it's also important and interesting to note that when I was growing up in China at a very young age, I learned that from my family that the two biggest taboos are politics and death. And to this day, my mother frequently messages me, tells me to focus on academics, stay away from politics. And so there is this idea of like one can staying away from politics is really staying obedient to the state, that there is a certain way to shield or extract oneself from the active political participation. But of course, on all of us as individuals living in a society, there is it is not a possibility to stay away from politics. It's really difference is between choosing passivity or active engagement. And now here in the US, I think on one hand, I should acknowledge this, that especially with regards to my work and public writings, and that I do, to an extent, live in the long shadows of the Chinese political system. And on the other hand, because of my current work that focuses on the ethics and governance of science and Chinese politics and US-China relations, China's political system is also a subject of my academic research, while I myself still live within its impact, and there is a certain duality to that as well.
Thank you so much, Yanyan. Can we turn to Rebecca?
Hi, thanks for having me here. My relationship to the Chinese state really only began in the 1980s when I first went to China. And I went, unlike Yangyang, I went because of politics and not despite politics. I was one of those leftist types who, from the United States, who was interested in communist countries in general, and I had been in the Soviet Union, and I went to China thereafter, and so my interest in China was almost exclusively, originally, animated through my interest in Marxism and communism as alternatives to the capitalist world in which I grew up and to which I was, and in which I was involved in lifelong protest with my parents and otherwise anti-war, civil rights, and so women's rights and so on. So I grew up in a politicized family, and my access to China was through politics. I subsequently started to study more formally, learned Chinese, and became now a professor, and I write widely on China in various idioms and various modalities. So my trajectory into China is entirely different from Yangyang's, of course, because I wasn't born and raised there. But that's my personal relation and my intellectual relationship to Chinese politics.
Thank you, Rebecca. Can we have Darren next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Darren Byler. I'm an anthropologist and live in Vancouver, British Columbia now. So my interest in China and my involvement with the political system really started in Xinjiang, which is in Northwest China. I went there for the first time in 2003 when I was an undergraduate student. And I was interested in kind of Marxist geography and how frontiers are made. I was interested in development because there was a lot of development happening, and I thought it would open up a space for kind of politics of solidarity between different ethnic groups, because this is a very ethnically diverse area. Over time, my focus sort of shifted though from grassroots politics. I mean, I'm still interested in that, to understanding how policing works, and how sort of grassroots state officials, the civil affairs ministry folks who monitor the population, how they do their work, and what their values are. Just one quick story, when I was living in Xinjiang, we would have the person assigned to me would come to our house, our apartment, on a weekly basis and scan the QR code that they had posted on our door. And then they would pull up our file on their smartphone and walk around in our room to see if everyone that was living there was registered to be in that space. So that's really how I encountered the state on a regular basis, and everyone else in the region as well, with this actually, active observation and inspection of your house and of who you are as a person. So I now focus a lot more on surveillance, but still very interested in how people can build solidarity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Darren. Yeah, I'm also very interested in building solidarity. So maybe this is something that we can converge on later on. So finally, can I have Loong Yu to share a little bit about your background?
Hi, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about the issue. I based in Hong Kong, and my work is mostly about labor education in Hong Kong, and also as an activist in the democratic movement. And I was involved in solidarity work with China labor nearly 2 decades ago. This gives me a very interesting perspective to look at China and its state and its political systems and so on. In the past 10 years, I mainly read and write and also observe the rising movements in Hong Kong, and then my last book is about the Hong Kong Revolt. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing how you came to work on issues related to China's political system. And I think as it has become clear, like even though we have different backgrounds, maybe because you interacted with politics early on in your life, or we came to work on China-related issues because of our intellectual curiosity, regardless, our path crossed today, and we share similar interests and values in terms of building solidarity across borders. So yeah, I'm really excited about today's panel and the discussion. So now I'm gonna turn over to Rebecca for her presentation. So very briefly, Rebecca E. Karl teaches history at New York University. She works on modern Chinese history, gender, feminism, political economy, intellectual history, and a modern histories of radicalism in China and globally. Her more public-facing writing includes 2 books. One is Mao Zedong and China in the 20th Century World, A Concise History, and the other one is China's Revolutions in the Modern World, A Brief Interpretive History. She's also a co-organizer, of Critical China Scholars, a left-leaning group of academics who promote reasoned discussion of China and China global relations, and co-editor of positionpolitics.org. So welcome, Rebecca. Yeah.
Thank you so much to TNI for the opportunity to participate in this incredibly important series of webinars. Thanks to the audience for tuning in, logging on, being here with us, no matter where you are, morning, evening, afternoon, deep night, however, wherever you are. I know that the time zones are different for everybody. And thanks especially then to the backstage folks who make the technology work for us. I'm going to speak for a little while. I have a couple video clips that I'll show along the way. I want to talk very briefly about China's politics from the perspective of the history of the Socialist Party state form. And before I begin, I want to emphasize something that that Sandy said, and that Yangyang and Darren and Ao also underlined, is that China is a living, breathing place. People live there, and the Chinese party state, no matter how stable it appears to be at any given moment, is always the subject of struggle and contestation from within and from without, as any historical state might be. Okay, all historical states are the subjects of contestation. Thus, while the contestation does not appear in China in electoral form, there are pressures on the state that force it to be responsive and that force it to move. We should never make the mistake of thinking that the Chinese state or the Chinese party is monolithic. I think that that's quite important. And so I wanted to start with that. Now I'm going to go back and do a little bit of history, just very briefly. I am a historian. I do believe it's important. So, but I'm not going to go all the way back. I'm not going to go back to the Warring States period or some other long, deep history. I'm just going to go back to 1949, 30th of June, Mao Zedong's speech on the People's Democratic Dictatorship, in which right ahead of the proclamation of the founding of the People's Republic of China, which was after all on the 1st of October, 1949, Mao signaled in this speech what the state form for China was going to be. Now, as with all Marxist analysis of states, which proclaim a Marxist analysis of all states, proclaims that they serve specific classes. A state is tied to specific class purposes. And once historically established, they indeed do serve the classes that have put them in power. While states in capitalist bourgeois countries present themselves as being in service to society as a whole and as representing the interests of the national people in undifferentiated form, the Chinese socialist state, as Mao proclaimed it after the revolution, was announced its class biases and announced that it served the class interests that corresponded to the revolutionary movement upon which it came to power, that is, the Peasant Proletariat Alliance. The class character of the state, that is, whose interests does the state dominantly represent, and how the state went about implementing its claims, were important points of analysis and of practical and theoretical dispute throughout the Maoist period. So even though the class character of the state had been proclaimed, it was not a settled matter of history or of practice at that time. However, we could say that the state in the Maoist period insisted on making its class character apparent and transparent. That is, there was no pretense to class neutrality. It was a state for and by the Peasant Proletariat Alliance on behalf of the revolutionary peoples of China. It operated thus in dual form as a democratic dictatorship to ensure the supremacy of the Proletarian Peasant Alliance in state practice and ideology. Thus, the state was to practice democracy towards what it called the people. That is, the people were those, the Renmin in Chinese, were those who supported actively or by class attribution the Revolutionary Party and its allies. It was, however, to be a dictatorship towards those who were either anti-revolutionary or whose class background was suspect. This duality, in other words, the non-neutrality of the state, was enshrined in the form of the state itself, in its democratic dictatorship form. Through the Maoist period, then, the national character of the Chinese state was defined through this peasant proletariat alliance, where power resided in the capacity to politically mobilize the masses on behalf of and in the name of the anti-capitalist, anti-bourgeois, anti-feudal class alliance that brought the Communist Party to power, and upon which the Communist Party's ideology and political legitimacy rested. By contrast, today, the state claims a universal continuity between its interests and the interests of the classless nation as such. While truly serving the interests of profit-making private and public, that is, state-owned corporations, and while systematically subordinating the interest of labor, whether industrial or agrarian, to those entities, the Chinese state, in the name of communism, now operates on behalf of wealth accumulation by the few for the nation. The state attempts thus to present itself in the seamlessness of its exercise of power, where power lies in the capacity to ideologically capture privatized economic development for national wealth, and where legitimacy lies in ensuring the stability of social development and sociocultural life more generally. Power thus appears everywhere in the guise of the national security state, although it operates quite differently in different places. And my co-panelists will have something to say about all of that very soon. I want to pivot now to discuss briefly the structure of the state and the relationship of the Chinese Communist Party to the Chinese state. And the video that you're going to see now was put together by the South China Morning Post, which is headquartered in Hong Kong. And it's from a couple years ago and prior to the national security law. So first, a 2-minute clip.
Since 1949, China has been ruled by one political party, the Communist Party. The party's leadership is enshrined in China's constitution, and it controls almost every facet of Chinese life. The party is organized like a pyramid. At the grassroots are around 92 million members, about 6.6% of China's total population. Of these, about 2,300 are selected to be delegates at the National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which convenes once every 5 years. From within their ranks, the Congress delegates select about 380 to become members of the Central Committee. And members of that committee select the Politburo. The size of the Politburo varies with each leader. There are currently 25 members. A handful of these Politburo members are selected to serve on the Standing Committee, which again varies in size depending on who's in charge. Right now, there are 7 members. The most important member of the Standing Committee is the party's top leader, the General Secretary. Since 2012, that's been Xi Jinping. In theory, the party elects its leadership from the bottom up. But in practice, it's the other way around. The lineups of the Politburo and Standing Committee are actually determined through closed-door negotiations and sometimes behind-the-scenes power struggles. Although their power has faded in recent years, party elders have traditionally played a large role in determining who gets a coveted seat, and their election is seen as a formality. At the same time, the Politburo and Standing Committee ultimately decide who is selected to be on the Central Committee. The election of a delegate to the party congress is also considered a formality.
Okay, sorry, we're going to work out some technical details so that hopefully clip number 2 will be louder and the black box that covers the subtitles will be eliminated. But sorry, it's this is all technical issues that have to do with the quality of the video. But what is, as is clear from the video that we just saw, then the Chinese Communist Party is the major factor in making policy, both general and specific. The lower levels of the party are, however, not insignificant, even if power concentrates at the top. The lower level party, and indeed the lower level bureaucracies, are not always in line with the central government. And one of the problems of the Xi Jinping era since 2012 is, in fact, how to regather power into the center after several decades of decentralizing decision-making. There are many reasons for this that I'm happy to discuss in Q&A. The point I want to make here, however, is that there's often an imbalance between the localities in the center, and this imbalance provides major issues for discussion and solutions at the central level. So having now understood that the party is pyramidical in structure, even though it the power often is understood to flow from the top down. Now, if we can go to clip number 2, to the state or the governmental bureaucracy that the Communist Party oversees. Okay, so hit it.
The Communist Party cements its rule in China by controlling all aspects of the government. China's top legislature, the National People's Congress, or NPC, has nearly 3,000 seats. But the Communist Party holds about 2/3 of them. The other third are reserved for non-party members, including technical experts and members of 8 other much smaller political parties. But they don't serve as a political opposition. While they can offer diversity of opinion, the very existence of those smaller parties is based on the condition that they accept the Communist Party's leadership. That means there is effectively no official political opposition in China's law-making body and no organized opposition movement in Chinese society. Some Politburo members are also state leaders and ministers in charge of government bodies that officially report to the National People's Congress. The NPC has the right to direct and review the work of these organizations, but the reality is that such authority is more of a rubber stamp in nature than a real supervisory power. The State Council, which is tasked with enacting national policy and supervising all government departments, is led by the Chinese Premier, who is also a member of the Politburo Standing Committee. The Central Military Commission is chaired by the party's General Secretary, giving the Communist Party direct leadership over the world's biggest military. Like other branches of government, China's judiciary is confirmed by the NPC, but it's the party's Central Political and Legal Affairs Commission which supervises the courts, and that's chaired by a member of the Politburo.
Okay, so the state, as is also clear from this clip, works in a top-down fashion, but the bottom-upness of the governing mode cannot be ignored. That is, intertwined relational networks that form and operate at the most molecular level of everyday life in communities ultimately link back to the formal bureaucracy. So this form of top-down, bottom-up has always played an important role in both the political philosophy and the practice of the Chinese Communist state. What is also important to note is that through the post-Mao decades, 1980s and after, the state has not retreated from social life, but rather has embedded itself further through the two mechanisms of capitalist marketization, that is commodification, and the re-empowering of patriarchal social networks. Of course, the third mode is also through surveillance. The state in China, thus, has become the handmaiden to capitalist relations and to patriarchy, and not a check on those relations. Indeed, on the one hand, every level of the Chinese state must earn its keep in the capitalist marketplace, and on the other hand, capitalist activity of any scope and size must subject itself to state control and surveillance. All of this is funneled by and through the reinvigoration of patriarchal relations. Now, the process of decision-making. So our last clip, which describes the process of decision-making. Go ahead.
At least on paper, the Communist Party operates on the principles of democratic centralism. That means policies are discussed, debated, and then voted on in a democratic way. But everyone must accept and follow the result, not work against it. What's not transparent is exactly how democratic this process is. Discussions and debates on policies happen behind closed doors, and it's hard to say how much internal debate really takes place, or whether party members simply go along with initiatives from higher up the chain. Loyalty and stability are essential to the party's leadership. They say that without those factors, development isn't possible. As a result, the party does its best to control public opinion. Mainstream media is used to promote party policies. Everything from encouraging people to abide by coronavirus social distancing guidelines to the number of children they can have. The internet and social media are heavily censored through China's Great Firewall and an army of censors who police the web, removing politically sensitive or subversive content. China blocks sites like Facebook and Twitter, while allowing access to Chinese-made and controlled sites like Weibo. The most important thing to the party is loyalty, be it in politics, business, and even entertainment. The Central Commission for Disciplinary Inspection enforces allegiance from within the party's ranks by maintaining discipline and adherence to party doctrine, increasingly through rule by law. Both inside and outside the party, people deemed to have been disloyal, including many activists, have been silenced, detained, placed under house arrest, or thrown into prison. Some disappeared for months or years before it was known what happened to them. Critics highlight such persecution as violations of human rights, but the party insists that's not the case. It says these prosecutions are in line with Chinese law and that anyone who falls foul of the law will be punished. The party's leaders say progress that benefits the population takes precedence over individual liberties, and love for China equates to love for the Communist Party.
Okay, well, that video ends with a sort of robotic sense that everybody is on board. I caution us to remind ourselves that that's actually not true. In sum, what I want to wrap up with is just say that the class character of the Chinese state is now completely shaped by and through its safeguarding of the conditions for capitalist accumulation. This does not mean that all individual capitalists are safe. Obviously not. There have been high-profile punishments meted out to individual capitalists. The status of the party as the shaper of the ruling ideology of the state is secured through constitutional and other means of organized governance, Xi Jinping's grip on power, exercised through his ascendance to the pinnacle of party power as General Secretary, has now been secured for the coming term. Where the pressures will come from and how successfully they are dealt with are matters of speculation and conjecture, and we can all engage in that some other time. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for providing us with this kind of historical context on how we arrive at this particular class alignment of the Chinese state today. And I also want to reiterate what you said about, the Chinese state as any other sovereign state or political institutions are living and breathing. And it's very important to situate political institutions and the state in a historical context. And I think our panelists later on will kind of dive into a little bit of deeper to how this China's, the state and things like, systematic forced assimilation of, Uyghur minorities fit into this global capitalistic system as well. So now let's just shift from the history to the contemporary, and I will turn it over to Yanyan to talk about how ordinary folks in China interact with the political system on a daily basis. So again, Yanyan Chan is a postdoc fellow at Yale Law School's Pao Cai China Center, where her research focuses on the ethics and governance of science and US-China relations. And born and raised in China, Yanyan received her PhD in physics from the University of Chicago, and she has worked on the Large Hadron Collider for over a decade. Her essays have been published in the New York Times, The Guardian, MIT Technology Review, Foreign Policy, and many other outlets. Yanyan, turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for the lovely introduction. And it's such an honor being a big fan of Rebecca and Darren's work, as well as the organizations that I'll work with. And I have a couple of slides as a visual guide. And so I will start talking that. Can you see the slides shared here? So since Rebecca gave such a great overview of the history and evolution of the Chinese party state, and I thought I would start with a little personal story of like growing up in China. What does the party mean to an ordinary Chinese person? And so this is a story from when I was starting my senior year as an undergraduate in China. And I was in a special program where we were a little bit younger. So one needs to be 18 or older to join the party. And one should also, as I think Rebecca mentioned, there are about 95 million people, party members in China today, and the party is joining the party is a highly selective process. Not only the ones who apply may not get in, about half would, but on the other hand, the application process itself has many filters, and not everyone is allowed to apply in the first place. And when we were in our senior year, we were coming of age. So the head teacher of our class said, well, you're becoming legal adults, and so you have the option of joining the party. Would you join? And so he was like, would you join the party? And he suggested two options. If you are planning to go abroad for further study, of course, there is no need to join the party. However, if you're planning to your future career in China, then I would suggest that you should join the party, because joining the party can stop a bullet for you. 入党顶一枪. And then we were all teenagers and we're quite naive about the politics in general, and we were science students. And so we were just really confused about this really graphic and vivid metaphor that the teacher made. And then there is one particularly precocious student who murmured, no, what this means is that a party membership is an extra layer of protection. If you got in trouble with the Chinese state, then expulsion from the party can be a punishment in itself rather than other legal measures. And one thing of note here is that of the two reasons whether or not to join the party, they were all practical reasons. There's nothing about ideology that was mentioned by the teacher. He didn't say whether or not you believe in Marxism or believe in socialism with Chinese characteristics or anything like that. And of course, I was a teenager myself, so when I went back home, I asked my mom, should I join the Chinese Communist Party? And my mom was like, of course you should. And then she said, 党最大, the party is the biggest. And in the sense of it was again not about particular ideology, but a sense of power. And as my mother, interestingly, she is on one hand a devout Christian, on the other hand a loyal follower of the Chinese Communist Party. And this may sound paradoxical from an ideological sense, that the communism is by itself should be atheist, but it actually makes a lot of sense for a person growing up in an authoritarian society where both party and God represent the two highest levels of power. And so that is the sense that my mother perceives the party when she said the party is the biggest. And her two biggest wishes before I left China for the US is, on one hand, I should get baptized, on the other hand, I should join the Chinese Communist Party, because she feels these are the two most powerful things in this world and the next that would be able to bless me on my journey. And being a very rebellious child at the time, I fulfilled neither of her wishes, because, well, I didn't believe in God, and on the other hand, I also didn't believe in communism, and also didn't understand what it means, and just couldn't subject myself to an organization that I did not agree with. And I wrote an essay for the New York Times last year about the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how my mother was both praying to God on one hand, and also wishing like God and the Chinese Communist Party would be the two forces that would be able to protect her only child from this natural menace. And from here, I would use the next few minutes to talk about the start of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Chinese Party state's response to it, as a way to illuminate how the political system of China works. And as Rebecca mentioned earlier, there is a lot of times there is this perception of the Chinese political system as a centralized top-down system, and how the central government sits in a panopticon and sees everything, and everything is dictated from above, and the primary tool of rulership is by fear, and this is a much too simplistic portrayal of the Chinese of the Chinese political system, as Rebecca mentioned earlier as well. Power within the Chinese bureaucracy is actually very fragmented between different levels, local and central government, and also between different government agencies. And for something like the COVID-19, the start of an epidemic, as we know now, there is this extended period of cover-up, but this, rather than a concerted grand conspiracy, is rather a result of conflicting interests at different levels. And this and as Rebecca also mentioned in her presentation, that there are different objectives in terms of how a party official or government official's performance will be evaluated. Of course, public health is one metric, but then the most important metrics in general are economic performance and in terms of social stability. So at the start of a pandemic, though public health is a concern, social stability and maintaining the economic growth would triumph that in the beginning when the effects of the pandemic are still not known. And these kinds of cover-ups happen first at the local level, as we know here that Dr. Ivan in one of the Wuhan hospitals as the one who first alerted her colleagues to this mysterious pneumonia at the end of December, and she was reprimanded by administrators at her hospital. And later, 8 of her colleagues who shared her warning on social media groups, and they were called in by local police. And among the 8 doctors is the very well-known Dr. Li Wenliang, who later died of COVID-19. And very notably, Dr. Li Wenliang, he was not a dissident; he was also a member of the Chinese Communist Party. And so this is the first layer in terms of how the cover-up starts at the local level. The second is when information flows within can flow within the party bureaucracy or within the government bureaucracy, but still be kept from the public. And here, in terms of public health, the example is in 2003. And there was also the initial cover-up to the SARS epidemic. But afterwards, the Chinese government implemented the public health emergency information system. So this is also an example of how the Chinese government, it is authoritarian, but it also needs to govern. And it also responds to actual events in terms of improving its governance and its structural deficiencies. And within the public health information emergency system, any person on theory, could report on health incidents to the local health commissions. However, only the National Health Commission and its designated provincial agencies are allowed to make public announcements. So the information could flow from bottom up within the government bureaucracy, but still be kept from the public. And notably, the Chinese CDC, unlike the US CDC as an individual agency, is not allowed to make public announcements. So even though within the month of January, Chinese CDC itself has raised its internal alert level to the highest, the people of Wuhan were still kept in the dark. And for example, 5 days before Wuhan went under lockdown on January 18th, and there was this 40,000 people New Year's Day banquet at Baibuting in Wuhan, and which later, of course, became a COVID hotspot. But this is also an interesting note here that this event, of course, serves a propaganda purpose and is a government sponsored event. But it also gives a sense of community and a genuine sense of celebration for the people there. And so this also shows this complexity of what the party means for the Chinese people. And afterwards, after Wuhan went under lockdown, there was notably a brief period where the Chinese government did loosen some controls with regards to media and public expression, and this can be understood as also serving not the party state democratizing, but in terms of serving actual governing purposes. On one hand, repression alone is not enough, and there are times when the government needs to respond to public sentiments. On the other hand, by loosening some controls on public expression, it is also a way for the government to collect information and understand better the pandemic. And there were a lot of pandemic journals. Most well known was Fang Fang's Wuhan diary. And here, interestingly, her diary was extremely popular on social media. But then she faced intense backlash, in particular after it was announced that her diary would be translated into English and other foreign languages and published abroad. And so here there is this fracture in terms of how Chinese people perceive their government internally and how they would like to be perceived beyond China's borders, that they may hold certain grudges and or disagreements or even resentments towards certain types of political control within their personal lives. However, they also have a sense of national pride and patriotism, and a lot of that outwardly manifested as a certain support for the party, especially when foreign relations and China's image on the world stage are concerned. And I should also mention that the Chinese government's brief loosening of public expression at the start of the Wuhan lockdown has a lot of limitations, including a lot of the citizen journalists like Zhang Zhan or detained, and she's still undergoing in serious health crisis in prison at the moment. And I think I'm running out of time, so I will skip the part about the search for COVID-19's origins, but coming to the bottom image with regards to surveillance, and so I think this is a particularly interesting image when there is a party flag here, but there is an elder gentleman wearing a red vest and red armband and doing this surveillance and crowd and control efforts within during the Wuhan lockdown, as the earlier video clip also showed. And for example, for internet censor, a lot of times there is this perception of high-tech censorship and other forms of control, like Darren's book has discussed as well, and I guess he will probably talk about it later. But a lot of that is done on the grassroots level by manual labor, and a lot of the individuals who perform these kinds of grassroots roles within China's political system. And with that, we'll go to the short video clip.
4个小时治安，帮助别人指示路，已经换人了，我们也可以往办事处里打电话，办事处随时都来人呢。 是起到一定作用啊。基本这个，要是我们这个华人他是轻易不敢出来的，他还是，因为我们这一条龙都是互相都有联系的嘛，他也知道我们这个性质，他轻易还不出来，他是做不动为止。我觉得国家给我们这老这么多福利，我应该回报国家呀，对不对呀？
So I think that is a particularly absolutely adorable clip that I feel that I know grannies and aunties growing up who resemble that. Though I grew up in the southern province, and so I think that video is particularly illuminating, as I mentioned first earlier. Like first of all, a lot of the party states control and surveillance. Though the Chinese government has this high-tech surveillance infrastructure as well as this perception in the West, but a lot of that is done by manual labor. And secondly, I think it's particularly like these are elder ladies, and at times in a photo with an elder gentleman, they're not physically imposing. But they do serve a certain function of intimidation and control, and their power did not come from their physical appearance of the power did not come from their own, but it is a certain delegated power from the party state and from the state security apparatus, and that has an intimidation effect on the public, and of course, and as the granny also mentioned in the video, that she also helps like point out directions to passersby, but then she also helps report suspicious individuals or troublemakers, especially during People's Congress or important functions that are in session. And so these I think this is a particularly illuminating thing, especially after the 90s when with the marketization and the dismantling of the former socialist system, a lot of times these the residential committees have replaced the former work units as these kinds of grassroots control units, and a lot of times it is these grannies and aunties with a red armband that on one hand perform a service function towards the community, on the other hand also facilitates the party state with its surveillance and political control. And finally, I would like to comment on the role of individual here, which I find particularly fascinating. That it's very, very obvious that the granny takes great pride in her work, and she also feels that she is performing a service that is in gratitude to, and she said, 国家, the country, and here there is a certain a combination here where the party, the state, and the nation become a combined concept in a lot of Chinese people's perception of what the country is, and gratitude towards the country or towards certain social benefits which they should be entitled to translate to a certain loyalty towards the political system. And also when the granny is performing this function, of course there is a service factor here. There is this genuine gratitude and loyalty, but it is also not entirely altruistic. And there is also a certain taste of power by wearing this armband and sitting there and having a certain type of power delegated by the state to be able to report certain people or stop certain people. And that kind of power is also addictive and appealing to an ordinary person. And finally, and I think it is also important to note that the granny here absolutely believes that she is doing the right thing and doing a good thing, doing a public service. And of course, though her role is actually morally rather ambiguous, and it's especially concerning stopping these people who come to report or protest with regards to injustices suffered at the hands of the state. And I think here there is a certain almost obliviousness that the granny may not be able to see herself in one of the troublemakers she's seeking to stop. And I think Darren has written brilliantly in his book, and he might talk about as well, there is a certain banality in these individuals at a basic level performing these basic functions for the state that may be morally and ethically highly ambiguous, but may seem like a very simple function on an individual level. And that's my opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Yanyan. That's a very thorough presentation, and I also enjoy your very moving stories as usual. So I encourage everyone to follow Yanyan's writing in various outlets. So as she lifted up in her presentation, ordinary Chinese people oftentimes, seems like very actively participate in the kind of a state-sanctioned surveillance over, quote unquote troublemakers or, suspicious people. So next, let's zoom out a little bit. I will turn it over to Darren Byler to talk a little bit more about the surveillance state at a more systematic and theoretical level. So Darren, up to you. Give it to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to share some slides with you all and talk about really three main things, sort of three moments that have already been touched on a bit, but I think maybe we can look at them from a slightly different vantage point. One of them has to do with the rise of the developmental state, which I'm just saying kind of arbitrarily starts in the 1990s, which is when China is opening up to the West and becoming the factory for the world in a lot of ways, but then begins to develop other parts of the country that aren't as close to the export-oriented economy. And then another moment begins, I think, in the 2000s, which is when the internet arrives and digital media begins to circulate, and means that people can self-publish. And then there's a shift in the way the state is managing media. Prior to this, it was really sort of state-directed public sphere, where the state was in charge of everything that was being published. But now it was more about managing and sort of controlling the discourse from a more of a distance. And so there's really a kind of freedom that's emerging and some autonomy that's emerging during this period, but it's also not fully free. So I'll talk about that. And then I'm going to talk about how the security state, which I'm saying here starts around 2010, really responds to these two earlier moments as a way of controlling the descent that comes from land dispossession and frontier making, and also the digital economy and those kinds of freedoms that I was talking about a moment ago. So just to understand the geographies of what I'm talking about, the primary development initiative inside China is called Open Up the West, and it refers to all of this purple area. And it began in 1999 with the Jiang Zemin administration, and then carried on into the Hu Jintao administration, and now Xi Jinping. And what it was about was kind of redistributing the wealth in some ways of the country, because the blue areas here, the export-oriented spaces, like Xinjiang down here, they were the wealthiest spaces in the city, in the country. And a lot of migrants were coming from these green areas into those areas, into the export zones, and we're seeing some income rise as well. But the western part of the country seemed to be left behind. And so the state talked about how they want to pull these people into the Chinese economy. There's a discursive level in how people talk about this, and then there's also the reality of wanting more resources and wanting places to develop. They wanted to build real estate in new areas, and so there's a capitalist incentive to develop these areas as well. My research happens in Northwest China, in the space called Xinjiang, which is the Uyghur Autonomous Region. And this process really began in the 1990s with first the Open Up the Northwest campaign, which was a precursor to the Open Up the West, and really looks at the way that migration from other parts of China, non-Muslims moving into this Muslim majority area, how that happened over time and what effects it had. The state encouraged, through sort of state-owned enterprises and private companies, migrants to move to this space in order to develop the natural resources, which is oil and natural gas, to expand the infrastructure, and also to develop industrial scale agriculture. So today, the Uyghur region is the source of 85% of Chinese cotton. And this had a pretty strong effect on the Uyghur population, which is 12 million people that live in the south, primarily of this area. They saw themselves being sort of pushed to the side. They saw their land being taken. They saw themselves being pushed into sort of tenant farming in the cotton industry. And they saw the institutions, the schooling system, the banking system, all of those things being taken over by the new population of settlers. So it really began to build an antagonism between the local population and these new arrivals. That's when the digital media began to arrive in 2010, with Uyghurs, for the first time, being able to buy smartphones and to talk about what they were experiencing, but also mostly to find new opportunities. So a lot of people were interested in leaving their villages where they felt themselves becoming poorer as the cost of living began to rise with all of the development, and trying to find a way to make a living for themselves and to provide for their families in the city. So they were using the internet, using an app called WeChat, which allows people to send voice memos, which are something that the state couldn't fully control, which meant that they were challenging the state-managed public sphere. So the censorship system could not really assess what Uyghurs were saying. And it began to make the state very nervous. So as I'd started doing my fieldwork in 2011, I was meeting all of these migrants coming from rural places, carrying their smartphones, trying to find work, but also discussing religion. So there was a kind of revival of Islamic practice that was happening at this time, which really meant mostly, praying 5 times a day or regularly, and discussing Islam and what does it mean to be a Muslim. A lot of the information they were getting about Islam was on their smartphones, was outside of the state apparatus because they were using Uyghur oral speech, which the state couldn't control, resulted in new forms of piety happening in public, with people becoming a bit more interested or invested in their Islamic identity. At the same time as all of this is happening, there's a lot of discourse around Islamophobia and the global war on terror. This had begun already in 2001 in China, when they started to talk about Uyghurs who, in some cases, there's been violent protests carried out by Uyghurs. And then in some cases, actual terrorism events where Uyghurs attack Han civilians. And so they started to talk about the Uyghurs as sort of a population that was prone to terrorism. There was a couple events, and here I'm getting back to the managed public sphere again, that really informed this. And the first was really the evacuation of 35,000 migrant workers in Libya in 2011, which you see in the image here. It was like a major campaign to bring these people home, and it was sort of the state showing that it cared for its workers, but also that it was an international power, that it had reach, it had a military presence in the world. And this became sort of the plot for a movie called Wolf Warrior 2 in 2017, where it's sort of announcing China's arrival on the global stage. And it was also framed around a kind of counterterrorism operation, with the Libyans being terrorists. Then there was attacks carried out by Uyghurs in Beijing and Kunming that happened in front of people's smartphones, that circulated widely in media, which meant that the general public was very aware that Uyghurs had carried out attacks and killed Han people. And so there was a lot of public sentiment around controlling the Uyghurs and stopping this from happening. And so we start to see a shift towards preventative policing, towards stopping people from carrying out crimes before it happens. Something that in the West is called countering violent extremism, or CVE. It's sort of, if you see something, say something, that sort of thing. But it's a bit different in this context because it's mostly the non-Muslims seeing something that Muslims are doing and saying something, and then many Muslims being taken away. So there's a kind of miscommunication that's often happening in terms of what's actually a threat and what isn't. This was really given a lot of presence and impetus in the political system in 2014, which is when the state declared the People's War on Terror. And they started to put up these posters in my neighborhood where I was living that said, Muslims can no longer dress in these ways. They need to be good minorities, no longer be pious in how they practice. And along with this declaration, they also began a process of building out the security apparatus. So they hired 60,000 new workers that are grid workers, low-level police. They're sort of like what Yangyang was talking about, but just maybe one step higher because they have a little bit of training. And they also hired many regular police as well. And then they began to work with private tech firms to break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet and begin to assess and control the Uyghur population. There's around 1,400 tech firms working in this space now. Some of the things that they built are tools to automate the transcription, translation, and assessment of Uyghur speech, and also automate detection of Uyghurs based on the phenotypes of their faces. So a lot of this is really enabled by breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and technology design that's coming from the West in some ways, but is beginning to shape the economy globally. It's something that you could think of as surveillance capitalism, but with variation in different locations. One of the tools that they distributed throughout the policing system was this one. It's called a counterterrorism sword, which is used to plug into someone's phone and scan their digital activity over the past years. And through these scans, they determined that many people, over 100,000 at least, had done things that were now criminalized. Things like being a member of a religious study group on WeChat, having a VPN, which is a virtual private network, having WhatsApp, all indications that this person was prone to terrorism. And in many cases, they were then detained, sent to these closed education and training centers, which you see pictured here, although they have watchtowers around them and really run in the way that a prison is run. Over time, they also began to build factories associated with these vocational training centers. People are being held here without consent. They're just simply taken by the police. And so this is why the Uyghurs in the region, when I was there last in 2018, refer to these as lager, which is a kind of, it means camp in Russian, well, in German, but is taken up in Russian to talk about camps from World War II. So the Uyghurs think of these as concentration camps. Many of the people that are working in the factories associated with the camps are working in textile manufacturing, which is, because cotton is such a major resource in this area. In 2019, the governor of the region said that all the trainees had graduated, but we didn't really get reports of people actually being released, at least in mass numbers. And then we started to see that very quietly, they had actually begun to change the names of the camps to detention centers, which are a formal part of the prison system. And one of the former workers told a friend of mine, Kong, that all of the former students inside had become prisoners. We can see in the state documents that 533,000 people have been prosecuted. This is from the state's prosecutor's office over the last 4 years, which is 6 times the national average. And there's still, I think, many that are waiting a formal trial that are being held in these detention centers. So there's sort of a shift from mass internment to mass imprisonment, a kind of warehousing of an unwanted population of people. So in my book, I talk about this as a kind of terror capitalism that is related to surveillance capitalism and also disaster capitalism, sort of a proliferation of capitalisms, of frontiers being made, at the edges of global capitalism. and really have to do with a kind of primitive accumulation or original accumulation, a way of making things that are outside of the market part of the market. And in many cases, there's a racialized component to these forms of accumulation. This is something that the Black Marxist tradition from Cedric Robinson and others talk about, how difference is actually accentuated in order to exploit people in new ways. Counterterrorism capitalism naturalizes the production of the figure of the terrorist as Muslim, male, and other, which makes them available for detention, or if it's someone who's deemed not too much of a threat, they can be put to work in unfree conditions. It also produces a space for private industry through private-public partnerships to expand their market share really quickly, to do data harvesting and also build new analytic tools, and produces a new political and in some cases laboring subject. So that's what my book is about, and if you're interested, you can take a look at it, as I'm really just sketching it pretty quickly here. But just to sort of summarize what I've talked about, what's happened is the political system has moved from a developmental state to a security state. These things are happening simultaneously. Development is still ongoing, but now there's a security apparatus that helps to support that developmental state. In China, in general, human rights is mostly about the provisioning of basic needs and security, and less about protections for vulnerable populations. And so that means that being free of terrorism is a human right in the Chinese discourse, and there's not as much thought about what that does to people that are sort of collateral damage, the people that aren't actually terrorists, aren't criminals, but are labeled as such because of their ethnic status. So really what's happening here is something similar to how the global war on terror has worked in many places around the world. The abstract fears of the protected mean that that Muslims can be targeted in really exceptional ways, and that their lives are less valued than the non-Muslim lives. So I want to show a short clip to show kind of what this looks like.
Darren, is it possible if we could save the video clip for later, because we're really running behind the schedule? Is that cool with you?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, all right. Yeah, we just want to give audience to some time to ask question in the end, so we're really running behind the schedule. Yeah. Sure,
no worries.
Yeah, all right. So thank you so much, Darren, for providing this much needed context for China's own version of war on terror, and also as Darren illuminated in his presentation, a lot of this forced assimilation of Uyghur minorities in China can be situated in the larger background of global capitalist system. Of course, I'm sure a lot of people are aware that overall the Chinese government's record on human rights and political liberties has deteriorated very significantly over the last decade. And in addition to this systematic campaign of forced assimilation and dispossession against Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, the Chinese government is also dismantling the very limited, used to be very vibrant democracy and civil society in Hong Kong. So it's all of this kind of culminated in this violent crackdown on pro-democracy activists in 2019, when a new bill was which would allow for extradition to China was proposed. So now I'm going to turn over to Loong Yu, who is a labor campaigner and a prominent leftist intellectual.
Okay, yes. Hello, everyone. I would like to update you about the Hong Kong situations in relation to China. And then the second issues I would like to talk about is in relation to the big crackdown in Hong Kong, and also many things happening in China. How do we characterize the Chinese political system? So firstly, there's I think yes, the audience here if they follow the news, they probably are aware that a great purge is now underway in Hong Kong. But let me stress one thing, that the Hong Kong crackdown is not just about Hong Kong. It's not just about the Beijing's government's revenging on the Hong Kong revolt in 2019. But let us begin with one term. The former chief executive of Hong Kong government, C.Y. Leung, once described Hong Kong as the super connector between East and West. It is how Hong Kong get rich, being this super connector, and it is how Hong Kong had helped China to rise as well. But I think there is an older term which I find more suitable to describe Hong Kong's role, and that is comprador. Hong Kong get rich because of being a super comprador between East and West. And it was able to do so thanks to its so-called free market. But one, well, I'm not a fan of free markets, so-called, but we must aware that the fact that if this free market Hong Kong still worth defending by the working people here, it is not because of the free market per se, but it is also because of the relative freedom we enjoy in Hong Kong, especially because the city also hosted a vibrant varieties of local social movements, oppositions, and protesters, and so on. And because of this, actually, this has held the birth and development of China civil society as well. So with Beijing's crackdown on Hong Kong, it also has deep repercussions in China. The most recent victim was the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements in China. Well, abbreviation, we can call it a Hong Kong Alliance. Hong Kong Alliance was most hated by Beijing for its continuous support of the mainland democratic movements by the Hong Kong people. For more than 3 decades, it held a June 4th memorial in the city, making it the only place in China to be able to commemorate the tragic crackdown on the 1989 democratic movement, until last year, when the memorial was banned. There is a series of Hong Kong civil organizations which have been disbanding or deactivating themselves in the past 2 years, but they have been rarely reported. What have been reported are mostly those Hong Kong-based and working for Hong Kong's organizations. But there is a sector of Hong Kong organizations involving dozens and dozens of them have been supporting China's civil society, from supporting persecuted mainland lawyers to promoting mainland labor activism. They are also among the first victims of Beijing's crackdown in both mainland and Hong Kong, but this is not fully reported at all. Because for 30 years, these Hong Kong groups, well, mostly self-help groups, networks, NGOs, and it covers a wide spectrum of area, from environment, labor, gender to community work, which has been committed to work inside China and have been very crucial in bringing the birth and the developments of self-organizations of citizens in mainland China. For myself, I'm more familiar with the situations of those Hong Kong groups which are supporting China labor. And since the turn of the century, we are talking about it 20 years ago now, around 10 Hong Kong groups have been set up to work in solidarity with China labor actions. Some will run community or labor centers in the Pearl River Delta. Some will choose to work with mainland partners or both. And there have been some local grassroots initiative as well in mainland China, and it is the working together between the mainland local groups or activists with the Hong Kong groups, which since the 1990s, the late 1990s, I mean, which helped to promote the rural migrant workers' awareness of their rights, because before the birth of this labor activism, many rural migrant workers simply unaware of their rights. So the beginning of this awareness raising helped to train the first layers of labor activists in China. And then through their hard work, one can see a raising of consciousness at the first decades of the 21st century. And this is one of the reasons why there have been so many spontaneous strikes in that 10 years, and which helped to push up the wages and improve the situations of the migrant workers. And actually, Hong Kong's influence did not stop at the economy or on rights advocacy in general. Actually, for instance, in academia, Hong Kong's support was also very essential in early 1980s, when China's university were just beginning to recover from the massive damage inflicted by the Communist Party since 1950s. Because since then, the party has launched the campaigns of so-called fourth transformations and so on, and many intellectuals were persecuted, and the party went so far as to abolish the study of sociology and social work and many other departments as well in higher education altogether. And sociology and social work was only allowed to restore in 1979. And these restorations was only made possible by learning from the outside world, including the Hong Kong academia. So Hong Kong has been crucial in the revivals of China's society, civil society, the revivals of proper higher education, and so on. And gradually, yes, through their own efforts, the mainland counterpart has become more self-reliant and has proven their abilities as well. If this trend continues indefinitely, then we will have a much better China. But for the die-hard conservatives in the Communist Party, well, they see this as a threat, and eventually they decided to turn the clock back. And hence, we have a more and more hostile environment in mainland China, and gradually in Hong Kong as well. So actually, before the demise of the Hong Kong civil society in 2015, the Xi Jinping government has already wiped out a lot of civil associations, or Wei Quan 律师, the lawyers who defended those underclasses or dissidents, and so on. Actually, but it is relatively also underreported is that in 2015, not only 300 lawyers were arrested and detained, there are also 24 of labor rights advocates were also arrested. So this was the beginning of the end for the Hong Kong group supporting Chinese labor. And then now, with the enactment of the national security law last year in Hong Kong, 3 or 4 Hong Kong groups of among the 10 labor rights advocacy groups in Hong Kong, they have to also disband or cancel the registrations with the police in Hong Kong as well, because of the national security law. So what happens in Hong Kong, the crackdown, I mean, has a grave consequence on China. So, but let us bear this in mind. And then right now I will begin the second point. So in the light of this crackdown, the regime is turning the clock back to a very inward-looking, conservative, restrictive, and repressive regime. And then we also see a deteriorating relationship between US and China. And at the height of the 2019 revolt in Hong Kong, the US Vice President Mike Pence made a speech targeting Beijing, which some consider to be a pronouncement of a new Cold War. I am hesitant to use the term, actually, because during the old Cold War, there was literally a hot war going on in many countries in Asia. First of all, yes, you know, in Vietnam, and in this hot war in Asia, the one who was in offensive was the U.S. empire, while the Vietnamese and many other peoples in the Southeast Asia at that time was on the defensive. And behind these dichotomies of offensive defensive, there was also a fundamental opposition between colonialism and anti-colonialism. So I think no one who was by that time, no one who was committed to popular democracy and self-determination for oppressed nations, they would have chosen neutral in this fight, let alone standing with the U.S. empire. But today the situation is very different. When we talk about a China and U.S. contest right now, using the old term Cold War may not be that productive, because the situation is entirely different. Because right now the U.S. Is not as offensive as before. It is offensive because, first of all, there is also Beijing has been quite aggressive as well. For instance, it actually torn away the basic law which it has promulgated in 1991. According to this basic law, there should be it is not only a recognition of Hong Kong autonomy, it is also an official recognition of Western interest in Hong Kong. So, well, if China does not like this concession to the Western power, then okay, they can replace it with something better. But what is China doing to Hong Kong right now is not replacing something better. It is replacing something even worse. And secondly, I think there is in the old Cold War, Taiwan is under the KMT's rule, and Chiang Kai-shek is a very repressive regime. But it is in Taiwan. But today's Taiwan is not the Taiwan in the 50s or 60s or 70s. So the situation is very, very different, and the usage of this term Cold War would not help in clarifying the issue right now. And this brings us to another issue that about the Chinese political regime. Some says China is an authoritarian regime, but I think this description is not very satisfactory, because a regular authoritarian regime is not capable to assert such kind of political, social, economic, and even thought control over the whole population. And if we talk about this kind of state control, this level of state control, it is very tempting to use the terms totalitarianism to describe China. But again, the term carries a very strong connotation of the old Cold War, and it may not be very helpful in identifying what is really new in the situation right now. So I think all these debates and discussions reveal one thing that I think is quite interesting, is that the reason that there is no one will debate about Russia. Is it a capitalist state? Is it imperialist? At least not as much as many as those numbers of people are debating about China. But China, I think the interesting thing is it has a bit of everything. By some measurements, it is a developing country, but by another measurement, it is an emerging imperialist country. On one hand, it is the sweatshop of the world, which means it is a kind of dependent accumulations of capital. So it is a small partners in this global value chain. But on the other hand, China's state, because of this strong state control, it is also able to pursue an indigenous development, an indigenous innovation, and in the end, it is a more self-reliant accumulation. So it is also the root, one of the roots of China's rise. So China is a collection of a huge series of great contradictions. So it's this is what is interesting of the subject. And then this leads us to one thing that, well, but there is one thing which can never change since 1949. China could change its definition of socialism at will or at any time it likes. But there is one very consistent feature of China's state. It is the party's hostility towards people enjoying freedom of the press, enjoying democratic rights, and so on. And the party's insistence of its divine right to brainwash the people. This has always been the case since 1949. It has never changed. And I once had a chat with a mainland dissident, which is I think his testimony is quite interesting. He was detained for a month for his activity, and when he was released, the secret police told him, "Look, the party respect the freedom of thought, and you can think what you like, as long as you don't voice it out." So, but this is really absolutely silly. How can you say you have freedom of thought when you cannot say what you think? But this is what the China state has always been since 1949. So.
Can I? I'm sorry to interrupt. We do have Q&A session. So can you wrap up really quickly? Yeah.
Okay. How about yes? In 3-4 minutes. Okay. Yes. Okay. So Lisa.
Oh, just can you wrap up in 1 minute? I'm sorry. Like we're really behind the schedule. Yeah,
okay. Yes. Yeah. So Lisa, to put it yes. To conclude, I think so. This is but the Chinese people, if they are denied this basic right, it means what? It means that they could lose everything anytime in the future. Even by now, well, one can argue that China has alleviated absolute poverty a lot and so on and so forth. But the problem lies here, that if the peoples are denied such rights, they are absolutely defenseless in the face of corrupted officials or unscrupulous employers and so on. So this brings us to one thing is very important, is that we this is a regime which is totally repressive, and this must be replaced by democracy. And this is the most important task ahead of us. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Loong Yu, for that impassioned speech. And also thank you for raising our critical awareness about the fact that the space once available to like activists, organizers, journalists, human rights lawyers, and government critics has dramatically diminished in China in the past decade. So now we're going to turn to Q&A. So what I have been reading in our Q&A box is there seems to be two most common questions, and one of them is the role of ideology that's playing in contemporary China. So I wonder if our panelists can say a little bit about like what is the ideology specifically, like Marxism and also, you know, even Leninism. Still, does it still figure very prominently? Does it still play a role in China's policymaking or its governance? Yeah, so maybe Rebecca, do you want to say a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that whatever Marxism remains in China's official ideological rhetoric is lip service at best and very attenuated. There is a receding sort of a notion of Marxism, and to my mind, a Marxism that denies that there is class struggle or that there are classes at all that need to, that are antagonistic to one another is never Marxism. So that's my baseline is that. And so that my point in my presentation was to even though it was to point out that even though the Communist Party remains in power and it appears to be stably there and has been now since 1949, that its class composition and the class interests that it serves ideologically, not merely as the ideology of economic, the non-ideological nature of economics. That is an ideology that goes under pragmatism. Pragmatism is an ideology. And so that the ideology of China that now is encoded in the class character of who the Communist Party serves is quite important to understanding how ideology works, because if ideology is to recede under economic development, and economic development is going to be the proof of ideology, you have there a circular system that then legitimizes the Communist Party based on its economic performance. And that's the powerful nature of that particular ideological move, which is powerful and has become the measure that is often enough used in China, that this now becomes, and that's the measure we could say that is being used in the United States now to build back better in order to counter that the United States has to find its economic mojo again in order to prove that so-called democracy is better than whatever they have over there in China. And so there's a real, the ideology is very, very powerful. And it's not unideological to say that economic development is going to be the measure of political legitimacy. It's not unideological. That is what the Chinese state has now become. I personally don't call that Marxist. I don't call it communist, even if our horizon is 200 years hence. It is, for me, flat out capitalist with, to coin a phrase, Chinese characteristics.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca. Anyone? Oh, Yanyan, want to chime in?
Yeah, I would like to add briefly that I think nationalism and increasingly a Han-centric ethno-nationalism is also an important ideological buttress to the legitimacy of the Chinese party state, especially after the Mao era disasters and after Tiananmen. And for example, for myself, I started elementary school in 1994, and that was actually the first year when the state implemented the patriotic education curriculum with the specifics. And I reflected a profound shift in a lot of ways, including how the 100-year of humiliation, including how the memories of World War II are being narrated in the public sphere, that a lot of them are very distinctly different from during the Mao era, when it was portrayed more as part of the communist revolution. And on this point, I should also mention briefly that there is a lot of talk about whether or not China, the Cold War / New Cold War narrative, and whether or not China is exporting its ideology abroad. And in the context of, if the primary ideological buttress is nationalism, it's not something that can be exported per se, but it's something that can resonate with autocrats across the world. And so that is something of note as well. And finally, in terms of communism or Marxism, I think on one hand, the Chinese party state at times used these names as a way to legitimize itself, in the sense of differentiating its political system from Western liberal democracies, and as a rhetorical device rather than an actual ideological framework. On the other hand, these words are also used by a lot of Western governments as a way to demonize China because of how these terms are stigmatized in the mainstream discourse here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I especially appreciate, Yanyan, you mentioned the sort of the rise of nationalism in both countries and all over the world, and in fact the diminishing of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism is a problem that we're facing right now across the board. So yeah, like, be aware and be mindful of that context is also very important. So I think there is another general thread in the Q&A box, is this, people are wondering about public sentiments and public opinion in China. So I think there's someone referencing this survey that was conducted by Ash Center at Harvard, which finds that Chinese ordinary citizens actually show quite a bit of a high satisfaction with their central government. So my question then for all the panelists is like, how do we interpret this result, and whether or not there's actual depth of this satisfaction with the government? And also, like, I think someone asked, like, is Xi Jinping really that popular? Like, why is he so popular at this current moment? So, yeah.
Well, I would say that Xi Jinping is, I would say that Xi Jinping is popular only in a very select portion of China. I would say that in Xinjiang, where Darren works, his popularity rating is probably not so high. I would say in Hong Kong and so on, his popularity rating is not particularly high. I think that in terms of the ways, I think there's two things here. China, and this is something that Yangyang spoke to, is that China contained the COVID crisis after many, many missteps, but was able to contain the COVID crisis within China. And then Chinese people looked out and saw death rates spiraling in the rest of the world. Crazy death rates that we have all now become inured to somehow, because they're not Chinese, they're ours somehow. If these death rates had been showing up in China, it would be a scandal of humongous proportions, not only in China, but outside of China. So the fact that we have become inured to the fact that we can sustain death rates like this in the name of democracy and freedom, to many Chinese people, it seems to me, appears absolutely unthinkable and crazy. And so there's one aspect of this popularity that has to do with the capacity of the Chinese state to have to have stabilized China out of the COVID crisis. And that becomes very explicit very quickly when you talk to folks. I mean, of course, I haven't been back to China because nobody can go back at this point. I mean, other than for very specific purposes. But we have a lot of students at NYU who come out of the Shanghai campus and so on, and this is they are rightly appalled. And so there's part of that is that. And then, as I said before, part of it is really a growing middle class or a bourgeoisie or a petty bourgeoisie and so on, who have legitimately seen their standards of living rising and have thrown their faith behind the Xi Jinping regime that is in part because of a nationalistic pride in the rise of China. A part of it is a Han ethno-nationalist pride, as Yangyang says, and so on. And and to bring back a question that I brought up before, there's a patriarchal masculinity to it that Darren also discusses in his book, and brought up in his presentation. There's a muscular machismo to this that China has finally become a man, as it were. Has finally become a muscle man on the world stage and has thrown off all of those effeminate epithets and all of those effeminate sort of sick man of Asia and, sing-songy whatever, and has now become a real player. And these are I mean, that patriarchal machismo is also then reflected in certain kinds of political economic arrangements that I can talk more about before. I don't want to monopolize. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, thank you. Darren, you want to add something?
Sure. So I see the ideology and support for the administration playing out in different ways in Xinjiang. And it really depends on the social position of the people that you're talking to. So yes, Uyghurs are not necessarily supportive, and in general are not supportive of the Xi administration, and feel like what's happened to them is really kind of a disaster that will play out for generations. And in Xinjiang, there's a Han population of people that have lived there for a long time, who call themselves local Xinjiang people, and they're often more sympathetic to the Uyghur position as well, and feel like what the state has done over the last decade or so is really a lot of overreach, and is going to cause more trouble down the line, and and really resents being pulled into the police apparatus or surveillance apparatus in their neighborhoods, being forced to go to Uyghur homes and surveil and assess people, because if you're a Communist Party member, you can kind of be drafted to be a volunteer to do this sort of work. So people feel as though their lives have really been disrupted, and that's really inconvenient, and also it's horrifying to involve yourself in the arbitrary detention of people who are not actually criminals. Then, of course, there's a migrant population of people, mostly coming from other places, who didn't really know what Xinjiang was like before they came, which, they came in the last decade or so. And they, I think, see themselves being empowered in certain ways to be in that space, because they're given jobs, they're given security, they see the technology being used to sort of support them, and being like, the state is there to support them as pioneers in the war on terror. And they see like counterterrorism with Chinese characteristics as something that is a sign that China has now arrived on the world stage, something that we were just hearing about. So there's a kind of a feeling of state support and of opportunity that I think makes people reluctant to be fully critical of the state in Xinjiang, among that segment of the population. So that's how I see it playing out there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Darren. So we're actually running slightly behind the schedule, but one last question. I think this is kind of that this comes up in a lot of people's questions, like in terms of this very moment, that this political moment that we're situated in, especially this quote unquote U.S.-China new Cold War. And I mean, like, I'm sure like a lot of people in the US can relate that, you know, a lot of those who are advocating economic and military confrontation with China has kind of seized upon this very awful record of repression and human rights violations to kind of bolster their arguments. And this is very common in the right currently in the US. And it's also this kind of rhetoric has already made inroads to the mainstream foreign policy establishment. So I guess like a lot of our audience's questions are, how do we, you know, at this very current political moment with the US-China conflict, how do we, for people who are outside China, express our support and solidarity to people who are living in mainland, and given the situation is really deteriorating? So before I direct this question to our panelists, can we show one of the video clips that was brought to us by O about the environmental rock band? Very uplifting. Yeah.
听重金属音乐，喝重金属水是吧？有的人看到了一些幽默和反讽在里面，然后有的人想啊，原来重金属也可以跟这个重金属推动重金属，也是可以这么干。关于社会各界对共识项目的真实性，有无违反国家法律法规和政策规定，向湖南省生态环境厅提出反馈意见。重金属污染在中国是一个非常严峻的问题，但是它很隐蔽。然后呢，其实它污染也不可逆，其实比大众都知道的雾霾其实更严重。做艺术也有今年就第10年了，做项目可能是每一个项目都不一样。有的项目是针对，比如说城中村拆迁的，针对那个案件的，然后也有像这种跟环境相关系的，也有性少数的。
All right, that's very inspiring and uplifting against everything that we just talked about. So as a final sort of remark, I want to ask maybe Darren, O, and Yanyan and Rebecca to share a little bit about, you know, what do you think people outside China at this very moment can support and express our solidarity with people living in China, especially those who are, you know, facing government crackdown and repression. Yeah, thank you.
If I may, actually, I wanted to add really quickly to the last question with regards to Xi Jinping's popularity in China, and I'll answer that in connection with how people outside of China can show solidarity. And so I think Chinese public's opinion of the Chinese government, and in particular the Chinese leadership, on one hand depends a lot on one's individual experiences with it. But for Xi Jinping in particular, for example, his initial anti-corruption campaigns, though it was a way for him to consolidate power, but on the other hand, also resonated with a significant portion of the Chinese public and improved his popularity, and also his advocacy of some of these family values that also resonates with portions of the Chinese public. Some of that Rebecca also touched on. And I think this to a degree also hinges on one's political and moral imagination. And for an ordinary Chinese person who lives inside the society like this, and one has to have a certain kind of psychological self-defense mechanism to justify one's conditions and to think something positive out of it. And at times, one's perception of the Chinese government, one may hold certain resentments and disagreements, but that can be more likely directed towards their local officials, and rather than manifested as an individual resentment towards the top leader. And then at times, the top leader can have a certain kind of almost a deified persona, and especially when that now there is a trend that is growing now as well. And so I think in relation to the question of how people outside of China can show solidarity with people inside China who need to both face the consequences of political oppression, on the other hand, to varying degrees are also complicit in the system, is to see Chinese people in their full humanity, and as individuals, to reflect on one's own complicity in systems of oppression, and to realize that no single government or country, whether the US empire or the Chinese government, are the only source of political oppression, and how all these various systems, as Darren brilliantly writes in his books, are interconnected and cross geopolitical borders. And then I think that is probably the most effective way, rather than just saying slogans or paying lip service to any individual agendas or interests.
So can we hear from Al on this? How do people show solidarity?
Okay, yes. Well, I think I just mentioned one thing which is interesting, is that some years ago, some media carries reports about a possible war between China and US. And then there is one follow-up post by a netizen which draws attentions of many. It said that, yes, well, we will support the war effort by first calling on the members of the party's Politburo to fight the war. And if they could not win the war, we will continue to send the entire membership of the Central Committee of the party to the front line. And if they can't win the war still, then we will send all party members to the front line to fight the war. And in the end, Chinese people will prevail. And I think it is a very funny post to the sense that there are lots of people in China feel correctly, I think, that such a kind of war, China and US and so on, is not their war. It is not their agenda to stand on the side of any one of them. So I think what I'm trying to say is that it is hard to find dissident voice in China now. But if we listen carefully, there are still genuine voices from below. And it is these voices we must pay attention to, and solidarity and have solidarity with this kind of sensible, open, and democratic voices from below. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing, and that is, I don't think from outside that our task is to assume that all Chinese need to be saved from their government or from anything. I think, as Yangyang said, there's a very large diversity of, just as there is in the United States or any other place, there are a large diversity of people who have a large diversity of commitments to either conscious or unconscious commitments to their lives. And it is not our burden to go and save them. The imperialists and colonialists tried that once before. I don't think it's the right way to go. I think that what we have to do, as Al says, is listen to the voices and try to amplify those in the ways that we have control over and in the ways we can from the positions that we sit in.
Finally, Darren?
Yeah, I completely agree with what the others have said. I think our task is really to listen and to amplify voices. It depends on your position as well, who you are, and in terms of your social network and what knowledge or skills you can bring. but that in general, I think should be our first response, is to listen. One of the things I've been happy, or was good to see, was sort of grassroots solidarity building around the Uyghur, the Xinjiang issue. I just posted a link to it, showing how Han people and Uyghurs can come together to talk about what's happening and think about, how they can respond or care for each other, even in small ways. And seeing people whose opinions and ideas have changed over time as they become more aware of what's being done in their name. And really thinking about opposing Islamophobia, opposing the exploitation and expropriation that capitalism produces, and fighting in solidarity for labor rights, for sexual rights, for religious freedoms, all of those things simultaneously.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very well said. And thank you again. We're at our time. So I, again, want to express my gratitude to everyone on the panel and also the entire TNI team. So thank you for tuning in, everyone in the audience. So this is the third of our 6 webinars in our China and the World webinar series. And you will find all the series that's available on TNI's YouTube channel. So the link will be in the chat. And we also would really love your feedback on this session. So if Rebecca can drop the link in the chat, is a very brief survey. Like I said, we really appreciate your feedback on this session, how you think it went, what we can improve in the future. And next time, as Nick mentioned in the chat, we will have a dedicated session on China's social movements. And of course, like it's a lot of the issues that we talked about today, like, the living space for these social justice voices and also pro-democracy movement. How does that look like today, and how do we show solidarity? Again, this is the running theme of this entire webinar series. And please note that this next webinar is actually going to run at our usual time, which is 8 a.m. New York, 2 p.m. Amsterdam, 6:30 Mumbai, 9 p.m. Beijing. And we will be hearing from a number of activists, organizers, and social justice movement builders. And finally, if you have any suggestions or proposals for how we can improve on the webinar series and future events, please email Nick Buxton. He will drop his email in the chat. And finally, if you enjoyed this entire series we have been bringing together, you might also want to consider checking out our podcast, State of Power, that you can find via the link in the chat. And again, finally, please consider also making a generous donation to TNI to support our continuing effort to pull together these wonderful panels. And thank you once again for joining us, and we will see you again soon, next time. Thank you. Take care, everyone.